Hi everyone, my name is Aria, and I work alongside Whitroy as an electrical tutor. Today we're going to walk through key parts of the Electricity Safety Regulations 2010. These regulations sit under the Electricity Act and set out legal safety requirements for electrical installations, fittings, and appliances in New Zealand. In this audiobook, we focus on Part 5 and Part 6, which deal with installation safety and the safety of fittings and appliances. The content is explained in simple spoken English to support learning and understanding. This audiobook is a learning aid only and does not replace the official regulations, which must always be referred to for legal and compliance purposes. Alright, let's get started. Part 3 Systems of Supply Reg 27 Systems in General. This regulation explains the general rules for systems of supply. It explains that a person who supplies electricity or line function services may choose the configuration and the voltage of the supply system, but this choice must comply with this regulation. It then explains that installations designed and constructed to operate at standard low voltage must be connected to a main system of supply. This requirement does not apply to low voltage AC railway signaling equipment. The regulation then explains an important exception. It says that the requirement to use a main system does not apply to fittings that are used, or designed or intended to be used, by a person in connection with generating electricity for their own use, where that electricity is not supplied to any other person. It also explains that if an installation, other than low-voltage AC railway signaling equipment, is supplied with electricity from a main system of supply, the installation must have at least one main switchboard. It further explains that the switchboard located electrically closest to the point of supply must be a main switchboard. The regulation finishes by explaining that a person commits an offence and is liable to a Level 2 penalty if they connect an installation to a supply of electricity in a way that does not comply with this regulation. Reg 28 Voltage Supply to Installations. This regulation explains the rules for the voltage supplied to electrical installations. It first explains that where electricity is supplied to an installation operating at 200 volts AC or more, but not exceeding 250 volts AC, calculated or measured at the point of supply, the supply must be at standard low voltage. It also explains that, apart from momentary fluctuations, the voltage must be kept within 10% of that standard low voltage. The regulation then explains that where electricity is supplied to an installation operating at a voltage other than standard low voltage, calculated or measured at the point of supply, the supply voltage must be a voltage agreed between the electricity retailer and the customer. It further explains that, unless the retailer and the customer agree otherwise, and apart from momentary fluctuations, the supply voltage must be maintained within 10% of the agreed supply voltage. The regulation finishes by explaining that a person who supplies electricity commits an offence and is liable to a Level 2 penalty if they supply electricity to an installation in breach of this regulation. Reg 29 Frequency of electricity supplied. This regulation explains the rules for the frequency of electricity that is supplied. It explains that the frequency of electricity supplied by a person must be kept close to 50 Hz. Apart from short-term changes, the frequency must stay within 1.5% of 50 Hz. The regulation then explains that this frequency requirement may be changed for supplies that are not at standard low voltage, but only if the electricity supplier and the person receiving the supply agree to a different arrangement. The regulation finishes by explaining that a person who supplies electricity commits an offence and is liable to a Level 2 penalty if they supply electricity in a way that does not comply with this regulation. Part 5 Safety of Installations. Now we move into Domestic Wiring Exemption. Reg 57 Exemption for domestic electrical wiring work. This regulation explains that when a person carries out prescribed electrical work under the domestic wiring exemption in Section 79 of the Act, that work still has to be done properly and tested properly, and it must follow ECP 51. It then explains what kind of domestic wiring work an owner of a domestic installation is allowed to do. The installation must have a maximum demand at or below 80 amperes per phase for single phase, or 50 amperes per phase for multi-phase. The regulation then explains the types of work covered. This includes things like removing and replacing fuse links, connecting and disconnecting fixed wired appliances, and relocating existing switches, socket outlets, and lighting outlets that are supplied by tough plastic sheathed cables. It also allows the removal and replacement of certain fittings, as long as the work does not involve working on a switchboard. These fittings include switches, socket outlets, light fittings, permanent connection units, ceiling roses, cord grip lamp holders, flexible cords connected to them, baton holders, water heater switches, thermostats, and elements. The regulation also allows installing, extending, and altering subcircuits, including submains, but only if the person does not enter any enclosure where live conductors are likely to be present, and only if the work is tested and certified to comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000 before it is connected to a power supply by an authorized inspector. We'll now look at certified designs for installations. Reg 58 Certified Designs. This regulation explains what a certified design is. A design is a certified design if it identifies the location or proposed location of the installation or part installation, identifies the standards that the installation complies with or is intended to comply with, and is signed and dated by the person who prepared it. It then explains that the design must be such that, if the installation or part installation is installed, tested, inspected, and connected in accordance with that design, the resulting work will comply with the regulations and will be electrically safe as required by Regulation 14. The regulation then explains that a person who installs, tests, inspects, or connects an installation or part installation that relies on a certified design is entitled, if acting in good faith, to rely on that design, as long as the work is done in accordance with it, and in that case the installation will comply with the regulations. It also explains that it is an offence to falsely certify a design, or to certify a design that does not comply with the regulations. We'll now cover rules for low and extra low voltage installations. Reg 59 Low and extra low voltage installations to comply with AS NZS 3000. This regulation explains that every low or extra low voltage domestic installation, or part of a domestic installation, must be installed, tested, inspected, and connected to comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000 if it has a maximum demand at or below 80 amperes per phase for single phase, or 50 amperes per phase for multi-phase. It then explains that all other low or extra low voltage installations must be installed, tested, inspected, or connected to comply either with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000, or with a certified design prepared in accordance with Part 1 of AS NZS 3000. The regulation also explains that maintenance or replacement work may be carried out as long as the installation continues to comply with Part 1 or Part 2 of AS NZS 3000, or is restored to its original condition, or complies with all manufacturer instructions relating to the fittings involved. It notes that low voltage AC railway signalling equipment must instead be tested in accordance with ECP 60. Reg 60 Certain installations must comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000. This regulation explains that some specific installations, or parts of installations, must be installed, tested, inspected, and connected so that they comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000 and also with other named standards. It explains that this includes installations intended for use with electrical medical devices, installations in hazardous areas, connectable installations in mobile medical facilities, connectable installations in pleasure vessels, and all other connectable installations. It also includes certain site installations, such as those located in marinas, those used in shows or carnivals, installations intended to supply connectable installations in mobile medical facilities, and installations intended to supply any other connectable installation, each complying with the relevant named standard. The regulation then explains that if certain systems are installed so as to comply with Part 2 of AS NZS 3000, they must also comply with additional standards. These systems include refrigeration systems that are not refrigeration appliances, animal stunning or meat conditioning systems, standalone power systems, photovoltaic arrays, emergency power supplies in hospitals, and low-voltage mains parallel generation systems that are connected to the national grid, where the relevant standards apply. Reg 61 specific rules for installations under Part 1 of is NZS 3000. This regulation explains that it applies to any low or extra low voltage installation that is being, or is to be, installed in accordance with a certified design prepared under Part 1 of its NZS 3000. It then explains that for 2-wire or 4-wire installations where no conductor is earth, switches and circuit breakers must be fitted in all conductors used in the installation, and all poles must operate together. It also states that switches, fuse links, or circuit breakers must not be inserted into an earthing conductor or into any earthing connection. The regulation then explains that the voltage drop must not be more than 5% under maximum load conditions between the point of supply and any socket outlet operating at standard low voltage, or the supply terminals of any fixed wired appliance operating at standard low voltage. Reg 61A installations in excavated areas must comply with as NZS 3007. This regulation explains that any installation that is or will be located in an excavated area above ground, including installations at mining or quarrying operations, must be installed, tested, inspected, and connected in accordance with as NZS 3007. It also explains that this requirement applies despite anything in Part 1 or Part 2 of as NZS 3000. Reg 61 a rule about 3-pin flat-pin socket outlets in low-voltage installations. This regulation explains that if a 3-pin flat-pin socket outlet with dimensions specified in as NZS 3112 is installed in a low-voltage installation, it must only be supplied at standard low voltage. It also explains that the earth continuity conductor must be connected to the radial slot, and that when the socket outlet is viewed from the front, the order of connection in a clockwise direction is the earth continuity conductor, then the active conductor, and then the neutral or other conductor. It finishes by explaining that installing such a socket outlet in any other way is an offence and carries a Level 2 penalty. This part covers rules for high-voltage installations. Reg 62 high-voltage installations treated as if works. This regulation explains that all installation, testing, inspection, and connection work carried out on a high-voltage installation must be done in accordance with a certified design prepared specifically for that installation. It also explains that, unless this part clearly limits how it applies to high-voltage installations, Regulations 34 and 39 to 46 apply to high-voltage installations in the same way they apply to works, with references to works treated as references to high-voltage installations. We'll now look at testing prescribed electrical work. Reg 63 testing prescribed electrical work on low and extra low voltage installations. This regulation explains that all prescribed electrical work carried out on a low or extra low voltage installation, or part installation, must be tested. The testing must confirm operational safety, ensure the installation or part installation is not electrically unsafe, meet the testing requirements of Regulation 59 or 60 as applicable, and, where the installation does not comply with Part 2 of as NZS 3000, follow the verification or testing process set out in the certified design. It then explains that this testing requirement does not apply where the work is done under the domestic wiring exemption in Section 79 of the Act, unless testing is required to comply with Regulation 57. The regulation finishes by explaining that failing to test prescribed electrical work as required is an offence and carries a Level 2 penalty. Reg 64 testing prescribed electrical work on high-voltage installations. This regulation explains that prescribed electrical work carried out on a high-voltage installation must be tested in accordance with Regulation 38, but with references to works treated as references to the installation, and references to documentation treated as references to certificates of compliance, records of inspection, and other documents that record tests and test results. It also explains that failing to test prescribed electrical work on a high-voltage installation as required is an offence and carries a Level 2 penalty. We'll now cover certifying prescribed electrical work. Reg 65 requirement for certificate of compliance. This regulation explains that a certificate of compliance must be issued for all general and high-risk prescribed electrical work carried out on an installation or part installation that involves the installation or maintenance of conductors, or the installation or maintenance of fittings connected, or intended to be connected, to those conductors. It then explains that a person who carries out low-risk prescribed electrical work may choose to issue a certificate of compliance, but is not required to do so. The regulation explains that general prescribed electrical work is not treated as complete until a certificate of compliance is issued, and that high-risk prescribed electrical work is not treated as complete until a certificate of compliance, along with any required record of inspection, has been issued. It also explains that a person issuing a certificate of compliance, or an electrical safety certificate, may rely in good faith on certificates of compliance issued within the previous 6 months for work done on the same installation or part installation. The regulation then explains that, despite these requirements, no certificate of compliance is required for certain prescribed electrical work listed in Schedule 1. It finishes by explaining that some of these requirements do not apply to general or high-risk prescribed electrical work where the installation has a maintenance management system in place and the required information is recorded under that system. Reg 66 Content of Certificate of Compliance. This regulation explains what information must be included on a certificate of compliance. It explains that the certificate must confirm that the prescribed electrical work has been done lawfully and safely, that the information on the certificate is correct, and that the required regulatory information is provided and properly authenticated. It also explains that the certificate must include information confirming the work was done lawfully and safely, that testing has been satisfactorily completed, that the installation or part installation is electrically safe, and that the work has not adversely affected the safety of the installation or any fittings involved. The regulation then explains that the certificate must identify the location of the installation or part installation, describe the work done, give the name and registration details of the person issuing the certificate and any supervised persons involved, state the relevant dates or period when the work was done, and be signed and dated. It also explains that additional information, such as test results, may be included. Reg 67 Information recorded on Certificate of Compliance. This regulation explains that every certificate of compliance must record whether high-risk work on a low or extra-low voltage installation was done in accordance with Part 1 or Part 2 of as NZS 3000, whether the work complied with a certified design, and whether any standards other than, or in addition to, as NZS 3000 were complied with. It also explains that the certificate must record whether the work relied on manufacturer's instructions, the type of supply system the installation or part installation is safe to connect to, and which parts of the installation are safe to connect to a power supply. It then explains that further identification details about the installation, the work, and the persons involved must also be included. Reg 68 Who may issue Certificate of Compliance. This regulation explains that a person may issue a certificate of compliance only if that person is authorized to certify the prescribed electrical work to which the certificate relates, or, where the work was carried out under an employer license, the person is authorized to certify the work under the employer's system of operation. Reg 69 Offences relating to certificates of compliance. This regulation explains that a person commits an offence and is liable on conviction to a Level 2 penalty if they falsely certify prescribed electrical work, claim to certify prescribed electrical work when the certificate does not meet regulatory requirements, issue a certificate that contains incorrect information, or issue a certificate of compliance for prescribed electrical work when they are not authorized to certify that work. Next is inspecting prescribed electrical work. Reg 70 High-risk prescribed electrical work to be inspected. This regulation explains that all high-risk prescribed electrical work carried out on a low or extra-low voltage installation, or part installation, must be inspected as required by Regulation 59 or Regulation 60, depending on the situation. It also explains that all high-risk prescribed electrical work carried out on a high-voltage installation must be inspected to verify that the installation complies with ECP 34, and with Regulations 34, 41 Subclause 1, 42 Subclause 1, 43 Subclause 1, and 44 subclause 1, with references to works treated as references to high-voltage installations. The regulation then explains that a person carrying out the inspection must take whatever tests, visual checks, or other actions are necessary to be satisfied that the work has been done in accordance with the regulations, and that the installation or part installation is, and will be when energized, electrically safe. Reg 71 Who may carry out inspection. This regulation explains that a person may inspect high-risk prescribed electrical work only if they are authorized to inspect high-risk prescribed electrical work, or, where the work was carried out under an employer license, if they are authorized to inspect the work under the employer's system of operation. It then explains that a person must not inspect prescribed electrical work if they personally carried out the work, supervised someone else carrying out the work, or issued the certificate of compliance for that work. Reg 72 Record of inspection. This regulation explains that a person who carries out an inspection of high-risk prescribed electrical work must prepare a written record of the inspection. It explains that the record must identify the work that was inspected, be signed and dated by the inspector, include the required authentication mark, and state whether the inspection was carried out in accordance with a standard or a certified design, identifying which one was used. It also explains that the record must state whether the work complies with the regulations, and whether the installation or part installation is, and will be when powered, electrically safe. The regulation then explains that the certificate of compliance must be attached to the record of inspection, and that if more than one certificate of compliance applies, the record must identify each of them. Reg 72 are what happens to records of inspection. This regulation explains that a person who issues a record of inspection must provide a copy within 20 working days to the person who contracted the work, or if that person is not readily available, to the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. It also explains that the person must keep a copy, either in hard copy or electronic form, for at least 7 years. The regulation then explains that a copy of the record must be provided within 10 working days if requested by WorkSafe, the board, the registrar, the territorial authority, the person who contracted the work, or the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. Reg 73 Offences relating to inspection. This regulation explains that a person commits an offence and is liable on conviction to a Level 2 penalty if they fail to inspect the work sufficiently to be satisfied of the required matters, give a written record of inspection that is false in a material respect, or carry out an inspection but fail to prepare a written record of inspection as required. Now we move into connection to power supply after prescribed electrical work. Reg 73A Before connecting installations to power supply. This regulation explains that before connecting a low or extra low voltage installation or part installation to a power supply, the person making the connection must be satisfied that the installation is safe to connect, that all required testing has been done, and that any required certificate of compliance has been issued or cited within the previous 6 months. It also explains that if the work requires inspection, the inspection must be completed and a record of inspection issued or cited within the previous 6 months, and where required, the certificate of compliance or a copy must be attached to the record of inspection. The regulation then explains that for low voltage installations the person must ensure correct polarity and phase rotation, ensure the protection of the supply is correctly rated, ensure the installation is compatible with the supply system, and, where the supply is from a MEN system, verify that a main earthing system is present. It also explains that before connecting a high-voltage installation, the requirements of Regulation 38 apply, with references to works treated as references to the installation. The regulation continues by explaining that if the person connecting the installation did not personally carry out the testing, they must cite documentation signed by the tester showing what tests were done and the results. It then explains that a person who connects an installation is entitled, if acting in good faith, to rely on certificates of compliance or equivalent certificates issued before the 1st of July 2013. It finishes by explaining that connection means the final step that allows electricity to flow into the installation or part installation. Reg 73B Offence relating to connection. This regulation explains that a person who connects an installation or part installation to a power supply in breach of any requirement of Regulation 73A commits an offence and is liable on conviction to a Level 2 penalty. We'll now look at reconnection when no general or high-risk prescribed electrical work done. Reg 74 reconnecting or restoring power supply to certain low-voltage installations. This regulation explains that it applies to a low-voltage installation or part installation that has been disconnected or isolated from a power supply, and where no general or high-risk prescribed electrical work has been done since that disconnection or isolation. It explains that if more than 6 months has passed since the last disconnection or isolation, the person proposing to reconnect or restore the supply must first give or cite a certificate issued in accordance with Section 3 of His NZS 3019. That certificate must have been issued no earlier than 6 months before reconnection, must certify that the installation or part installation is suitable for continued use, and must be issued by a person authorized to certify mains work. The regulation also explains that a person reconnecting or restoring supply is entitled, if acting in good faith, to rely on a written confirmation from the owner that no general or high-risk prescribed electrical work has been done since disconnection. It finishes by explaining that failing to comply with these requirements is an offence and carries a Level 2 penalty. This part covers certifying installations. Reg 74 Electrical Safety Certification. This regulation explains that it applies to prescribed electrical work carried out on an installation, a part installation, or any fitting that supplies electricity to an installation or part installation. It explains that once the work is complete, the person who completed it must issue an electrical safety certificate if they are satisfied that the installation or part installation is safe to use, is electrically safe, complies with the regulations, and that any maintenance, alteration, or addition has not adversely affected other parts of the installation. It explains that if the installation or part installation was disconnected from the power supply while the work was done, the work is treated as complete only once it is connected or reconnected. The regulation then explains what an electrical safety certificate must contain, including confirmation that the installation is safe to use, whether the certificate applies to the whole installation or only part of it, the location of the installation, the required authentication mark, the date the connection was done, the names and registration details of the person who did the connection and any supervisor, and employer license details where applicable. It also explains that where prescribed electrical work is done without disconnecting the power supply, references to connection must be read as references to completion of the work. It finishes by explaining that an electrical safety certificate also acts as confirmation for Building Act purposes that prescribed electrical work complies with the building code. Reg 74B exception for operators with maintenance management systems. This regulation explains that an electrical safety certificate does not need to be issued if the installation owner or operator has a maintenance management system in place, and that system records and keeps information equivalent to what would otherwise be required on an electrical safety certificate, except for the authentication mark. Reg 74C time when electrical safety certificate to be issued. This regulation explains that an electrical safety certificate must be issued as soon as practicable after the installation or part installation is connected to a power supply, and in all cases no later than 20 working days after connection. Reg 74D offences relating to electrical safety certificates. This regulation explains that a person commits an offence and is liable on conviction to a Level 2 penalty if they issue an electrical safety certificate without being properly satisfied, issue a certificate that does not meet regulatory requirements, or fail to issue a required electrical safety certificate within the required time. We'll now look at record keeping. Reg 74E what happens to certificates of compliance. This regulation explains what must be done with certificates of compliance. It explains who is responsible for a certificate, and that a copy must be provided within 20 days after completing the work to the person who contracted the work, or if that person is not readily available, to the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. It also explains that the responsible person must retain a copy, either in hard copy or electronic form, for at least 7 years. It then explains that copies must be provided within 10 working days if requested by WorkSafe, the board, the registrar, the territorial authority, the person who contracted the work, or the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. It also explains that these requirements do not prevent anyone who issues a certificate from retaining their own copy. Reg 74F details of high-risk work to be lodged on database. This regulation explains that details of high-risk prescribed electrical work, including details of the Certificate of Compliance, must be lodged on the database referred to in Regulation 112A. It explains that this must be done by the person who inspected the work, and within 20 working days after the date of the record of inspection. It also explains that the specific details to be lodged, and how they must be lodged, are determined by WorkSafe. Reg 74G. What happens to electrical safety certificates? This regulation explains that a person who issues an electrical safety certificate must provide a copy within 20 working days to the person who contracted the work, or if that person is not readily available, to the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. It also explains that a copy must be kept for at least 7 years. The regulation then explains that a copy must be provided within 10 working days if requested by WorkSafe, the board, the registrar, the territorial authority, the person who contracted the work, or the owner or occupier of the place or thing where the installation or part installation is located. It also explains that where Regulation 74B applies, the owner or occupier must provide recorded information when requested by the same authorities. Reg 74H. Offences relating to record keeping. This regulation explains that a person commits an offence and is liable on conviction to a Level 2 penalty if they fail to comply with the record-keeping requirements set out in Regulations 74E to 74G. Now we move into miscellaneous. Reg 74I. Location of installations. This regulation explains how the location of an installation or part installation is identified for the purposes of certified designs, certificates of compliance, and electrical safety certificates. It explains that for installations in permanent locations, the location is identified by the street address, or where there is no street address, by a description of the place with another form of identification such as GPS coordinates. It also explains that for connectable installations, a unique identifier such as a chassis number is used, and for installations that will be but are not yet in a permanent location, a unique identifier is used to identify the thing for location purposes. This part covers periodic assessments. Reg 75. Periodic assessments of certain installations. This regulation explains that the owners and operators of certain installations must make sure those installations are periodically assessed to confirm that they are electrically safe and comply with these regulations. It explains that this requirement applies to low-voltage installations in caravan parks, which must be assessed in accordance with as NZS 3001.1 at intervals not exceeding 5 years, and to low-voltage installations in boat marinas, which must be assessed in accordance with as NZS 3004.1 at intervals not exceeding 5 years. It also applies to low-voltage installations at demolition and construction sites assessed in accordance with as NZS 3012, and to low-voltage installations at carnivals and fairgrounds assessed in accordance with as NZS 3002 at intervals not exceeding 1 year. The regulation further explains that it applies to low-voltage installations, other than domestic installations, and hazardous areas assessed in accordance with as NZS 6007.17. It also applies to low-voltage and extra-low-voltage installations intended for use with electrical medical devices, whether those devices are located in mobile medical facilities assessed in accordance with NZS 6115, or in any other medical location assessed in accordance with as NZS 3003. The regulation then explains that the assessments for caravan parks, marinas, and demolition and construction sites may only be carried out by a person who is authorized to assess prescribed electrical work for the relevant type of installation in that location. It also explains that assessments for carnivals, fairgrounds, hazardous areas, and medical locations may only be carried out by a person who has the competencies specified in the relevant standard. It explains that a person who completes a periodic assessment must complete a record of assessment, must state whether the assessment was carried out in accordance with a standard and identify that standard, and must state whether the assessment was carried out in accordance with a certified design and identify that design if applicable. The person must give the record of assessment to the person requesting the assessment and must keep a copy for at least 3 years, or send a copy to WorkSafe. It also explains that if the relevant standard prescribes a specific form for a record of assessment, that form must be used. The regulation then explains that an owner who keeps an installation in service commits an offence if a required periodic assessment is not carried out. It also explains that a person who carries out an assessment commits an offence if they are not authorized or do not have the required competencies, or if they fail to complete the record of assessment as required. It further explains that a person commits an offence if they use an installation that is required to be periodically assessed knowing that the assessment was carried out by someone to whom those offence provisions apply. The regulation finishes by explaining that, to avoid doubt, the assessment requirements and the assessment intervals set out here apply despite anything to the contrary in the reference standards. Next is connectable installations. Reg 76 No supply without warrant of electrical fitness. This regulation explains that before allowing or authorizing a connection to supply electricity to a connectable installation in a vehicle, relocatable building, or pleasure vessel, the person supplying electricity must verify that the connectable installation has a current warrant of electrical fitness. It also explains that failing to do this is an offence and carries a Level 1 penalty. Reg 77 Restrictions on use of connectable installations. This regulation explains that a person must not hire out, lease out, or offer to hire or lease a vehicle, relocatable building, or pleasure vessel that contains a connectable installation unless that installation has a current warrant of electrical fitness. It also explains that failing to comply with this requirement is an offence and carries a Level 1 penalty. Reg 78 Issue of warrants of electrical fitness for connectable installations. This regulation explains who is allowed to issue a warrant of electrical fitness for a connectable installation. It explains that a warrant may be issued by a person who is authorized to inspect mains work. It also explains that a person who was authorized, immediately before these regulations came into force, to issue warrants of electrical fitness may continue to do so, but only for the same class of connectable installations covered by that authorization. The regulation further explains that where a connectable installation has been certified under Regulation 66, the person who carried out that certification may issue the warrant of electrical fitness at the same time as the certification is done. The regulation then explains that every warrant of electrical fitness must normally be issued in accordance with as NZS 3001.2. It explains that there are specific exceptions. A warrant for a connectable installation in a pleasure vessel must be issued in accordance with as NZS 3004.2. A warrant for a connectable installation in a mobile medical facility must be issued in accordance with NZS 6115. A warrant for an imported connectable installation must be issued in accordance with as NZS 3001.2, but only after the installation has been assessed for compliance with Part 1 of as NZS 3000. The regulation then explains the duties of a person who issues a warrant of electrical fitness. That person must give the warrant to the person who requested it, must keep a copy for at least 3 years or send a copy to WorkSafe, must complete a warrant of electrical fitness sticker in the form prescribed or approved by WorkSafe, and must fix that sticker in a prominent place on the connectable installation. It then explains when a warrant of electrical fitness expires. A warrant expires on the earlier of the date a new warrant is issued for the connectable installation, or 4 years from the date it was issued, or, in the case of a mobile medical facility, 1 year from the date it was issued. The regulation also explains that every warrant of electrical fitness must be in the form prescribed by the relevant standard, or in a form approved by WorkSafe. It explains that if WorkSafe charges a fee to supply warrant forms, that fee must match the amount set out in Schedule 5. The regulation finishes by explaining that a person commits an offence and is liable to a Level 1 penalty if they issue a warrant otherwise than in accordance with this regulation, issue a warrant for a connectable installation that is electrically unsafe, or issue a warrant without being authorized to do so. Now we move into Part 6, Safety of Fittings and Appliances. Reg 79, Maintenance of Domestic Appliances. This regulation explains that when a person carries out prescribed electrical work under the exemption in Section 80 of the Act for Maintenance of Domestic Appliances, that work must be carried out in accordance with ECP 50. It also explains that, for the purposes of Section 80 Subclause 1 Paragraph C of the Act, the work that an owner of an appliance may do or help with is limited to work on appliances that operate at low voltage. Reg 80, New and used fittings and appliances to be electrically safe. This regulation explains that every new or used fitting, and every new or used appliance, that is sold, offered for sale, supplied, or offered for supply must be electrically safe. It explains that a new fitting or appliance is considered electrically safe if it complies with as NZS 3820, or with the relevant official standard listed in Schedule 4. Or, for imported appliances under the Conformity Cooperation Agreement, complies with that agreement. It also explains that a used appliance is considered electrically safe at the time of sale if it has been tested, inspected, and tagged in accordance with as NZS 3760, or has been disabled and marked in accordance with as NZS 4701, or, for used electrical medical devices, has been tested and marked in accordance with as NZS 3551. The regulation finishes by explaining that selling or supplying a fitting or appliance that is known to be, or is recklessly supplied as, electrically unsafe is an offence and carries a Level 2 penalty. Reg 81, Evidence of compliance with standards. This regulation explains that a test report or certificate of conformity showing that a low voltage or extra low voltage fitting or appliance complies with as NZS 3820, or with a standard listed in Schedule 4, is conclusive evidence of compliance unless proven otherwise. It explains that a test report must be an original or certified copy issued by an appropriately accredited or approved laboratory, or under the IEC/ECB scheme. It also explains that a certificate of conformity must be issued by a recognized and accredited certification body, either under the Joint Australia and New Zealand accreditation system or under an international mutual recognition arrangement. Reg 82, Offences relating to false or incorrect marking. This regulation explains that a person commits an offence and is liable to a Level 2 penalty if they tag or mark a fitting or appliance with a false or incorrect electrical safety marking. It also explains that it is an offence to sell or offer for sale a fitting or appliance that bears CCC marks where those marks were not applied in accordance with the Conformity Cooperation Agreement, or do not comply with that agreement. The regulation also explains that it is an offence to sell or supply a declared medium risk article where required supplier declarations or approvals are missing or non-compliant. Reg 83, Supplier Declaration of Conformity required before sale of declared medium risk articles. This regulation explains that WorkSafe may declare certain low voltage or extra low voltage fittings or appliances to be declared medium risk articles. It explains that these articles must not be sold or supplied unless the New Zealand manufacturer or importer has made a supplier declaration of conformity, or the article is deemed to be approved by WorkSafe and all conditions of that deemed approval are met. It explains that a supplier declaration must describe the article, state that it complies with the appropriate Schedule 4 standard, as NZS 3820, or the Conformity Cooperation Agreement, and be in the form prescribed by WorkSafe or otherwise comply with ISO IEC 17050-1. It also explains that supplier declarations cease to be valid if material changes are made to the article or its specifications, or if required statements are no longer correct. The regulation finishes by explaining that selling or supplying a declared medium risk article without meeting these requirements is an offence carrying a Level 2 penalty, and that declarations under this regulation are secondary legislation. Reg 84, Declared high-risk articles not to be sold unless approved. This regulation explains that WorkSafe may declare certain fittings or appliances to be declared high-risk articles. It explains that these articles must not be sold or supplied unless they are approved for sale by WorkSafe, or are deemed to be approved under the regulations and all conditions of that approval are met. It explains that selling or supplying a declared high-risk article without approval, or without complying with approval conditions, is an offence carrying a Level 2 penalty. It also explains that declarations under this regulation are secondary legislation. Reg 83 are deemed approval by WorkSafe for sale of medium-risk EESS products. This regulation explains that a declared medium-risk article is deemed to be approved by WorkSafe if it is a registered EESS product and the New Zealand manufacturer or importer is a registered EESS supplier for that article. It explains that WorkSafe may specify conditions for deemed approval by notice in the Gazette, and may vary, withdraw, revoke, or add conditions to that deemed approval. It also explains that any such notice takes effect on the 7th day after notification. Reg 85 approval by WorkSafe for sale of declared high-risk articles. This regulation explains that a person may apply to WorkSafe for approval to sell a declared high-risk article by using the prescribed form and paying the prescribed fee. It explains that WorkSafe may seek expert advice on compliance, must notify the applicant of its decision and any conditions, and may later vary, withdraw, or add conditions to an approval by giving written notice. Reg 86 deemed approval by WorkSafe for sale of declared high-risk articles. This regulation explains that a declared high-risk article is treated as having WorkSafe approval if the article is approved or certified by an organization, agency, program, or compliance regime that WorkSafe recognizes, and if the article meets any conditions attached to that approval or certification. It explains that WorkSafe may recognize these organizations or programs by notice in the Gazette, may set conditions for deemed approval, and may vary, withdraw, or add conditions by Gazette notice. It also explains that any notice about varying or withdrawing deemed approval takes effect on the 7th day after notification. Reg 86 are deemed approval by WorkSafe for sale of high-risk EESS products. This regulation explains that a declared high-risk article is deemed to have WorkSafe approval if it is a registered EESS product and the New Zealand manufacturer or importer is a registered EESS supplier for that article. It explains that WorkSafe may set conditions on this deemed approval by Gazette notice, and may vary, withdraw, revoke, or add conditions, with any such notice taking effect on the 7th day after notification. Reg 87 prohibitions relating to fittings and appliances. This regulation explains that if WorkSafe reasonably believes a fitting or appliances, or may be, electrically unsafe, it may prohibit activities such as manufacture, importation, sale, installation, or use of that fitting or appliance. It also explains that if an item is imported under the Conformity Corporation Agreement but does not actually comply with that agreement, WorkSafe may prohibit its import, sale, installation, or use. The regulation explains that a prohibition must take effect from a stated date, must describe the fitting or appliance or class affected, and must give brief reasons for the prohibition. It also explains that where possible, notice must be given to known New Zealand parties before the prohibition takes effect, that prohibitions may be varied or revoked, and that breaching a prohibition is an offence carrying a Level 2 penalty. It finishes by explaining that prohibitions made under this regulation are secondary legislation. Reg 88 supply of electricity to handheld appliances. This regulation explains that handheld appliances must be supplied with electricity either by a suitable plug, a suitable cord connector, or a permanent connection. It also explains that the voltage supplied to a handheld appliance must not exceed 250 AC volts to earth. The regulation finishes by explaining that installing or using a handheld appliance in breach of these requirements is an offence carrying a Level 2 penalty. Reg 89 use of handheld appliances in certain high-risk situations. This regulation explains that when a handheld appliance is used by a person who is immersed, partly immersed, or substantially conductive, the appliance must meet specific safety supply conditions. These include being fixed wired and supplied from a source isolated from earth with a voltage between conductors not exceeding 250 AC volts, being supplied from a safety extra low voltage source, or being double insulated and supplied through an RCD. It also explains that when handheld appliances are used indoors in normally damp situations, outdoors, or in buildings under construction, additional safe supply options apply, including monitored earth systems, reduced voltage to earth, RCD protection, isolation from earth, or double insulation. The regulation finishes by explaining that using, allowing use of, or supervising use of a handheld appliance in breach of these requirements is an offense carrying a Level 2 penalty. Reg 89 A use of handheld appliances in cramped spaces. This regulation explains that when a handheld appliance is used in a space where movement is severely restricted or obstructed, such as a motor vehicle workshop, the appliance must meet similar protective supply conditions. These include supply from an isolated source with voltage between conductors not exceeding 250 AC volts, supply from a safety extra low voltage source, or being double insulated and supplied through an RCD. It also explains that using, allowing use of, or supervising use of a handheld appliance in breach of these requirements is an offense carrying a Level 2 penalty. We'll now look at testing appliances. Reg 90 Testing appliances after certain work done on them. This regulation explains that before releasing an appliance from control after prescribed electrical work, or any work that may affect its electrical safety, the person must test the appliance. It explains that the appliance must be confirmed as electrically safe in accordance with ECP 50 for domestic appliance maintenance work, as NZS 3551 for low or extra low voltage electrical medical devices, or as NZS 3760 for all other low or extra low voltage appliances. It also explains that if an appliance is electrically unsafe, it must be adequately disabled and marked, and that doing so in accordance with as NZS 4701 is treated as compliance. The regulation finishes by explaining that failing to comply with these testing requirements is an offense carrying a Level 2 penalty. This part covers periodic assessment of electrical medical devices. Reg 91 Periodic assessment of electrical medical devices. This regulation explains that the owner of an electrical medical device must ensure the device is periodically assessed in accordance with as NZS 3551 to confirm it is electrically safe and compliant. It explains that the results of each assessment must be recorded, and that the person who completes the assessment must give the record to the person who requested it and keep a copy for at least 3 years or send a copy to WorkSafe. It finishes by explaining that failing to have a required assessment carried out, or using or allowing use of an electrical medical device that has not been assessed as required, is an offense carrying a Level 1 penalty, unless emergency use justifies the situation. Part 8 Working Practices. Reg 100 Safety responsibilities of person who carries out work. This regulation explains the safety responsibilities of a person who carries out prescribed electrical work, or other work listed in Schedule 1. It explains that, as far as it is reasonably practicable, the person must check before starting work that any equipment and any personal protective equipment they will use is in good condition and safe for the job. It also explains that the person must follow any work procedures approved by their employer, where those procedures apply. The regulation then explains that the person must use the equipment and personal protective equipment provided in a competent and proper way. It further explains that all electrical work carried out on electrical equipment operating at low voltage or extra low voltage must comply with as NZS 4836, or with a certified design where one applies. The regulation finishes by explaining that these responsibilities are in addition to, and do not limit, the responsibilities that the person already has under the Health and Safety at Work Act 2015. Reg 101 Responsibility of employers for safety of employees. This regulation explains the responsibilities of an employer for the safety of employees who carry out prescribed electrical work, or other work listed in Schedule 1. It explains that an employer must, so far as is reasonably practicable, make sure the employee is safe while carrying out the work. It also explains that the employer must take particular steps to meet this responsibility. The regulation then explains that the employer must provide safe working procedures for employees to follow while doing the work. It also explains that the employer must make sure any associated equipment and any personal protective equipment used by the employee is properly arranged, designed, made, tested, inspected, and maintained so that it is safe to use. It further explains that the employer must make sure, so far as is reasonably practicable, that the employee has enough knowledge and experience for the type of work being done, and has been properly trained in the safe use of the equipment, the personal protective equipment, and the work procedures. It also explains that, immediately before starting work, the employee must check that the equipment and personal protective equipment are in good condition, and that the employee uses the equipment and procedures approved by the employer. The regulation then explains that the requirement for adequate knowledge and experience does not apply if the employee is in training, provided the employer makes sure the employee is adequately supervised to keep them safe. The regulation finishes by explaining that these employer responsibilities are in addition to, and do not limit, the responsibilities the employer already has under the Health and Safety at Work Act 2015, Part 9 Miscellaneous Reg 111 Gazette Notices to be published on Internet site. This regulation explains the requirement for publishing Gazette notices on the Internet. It explains that WorkSafe must make sure that a copy of every notice that is published or given in the Gazette under these regulations, and that is not secondary legislation, is also published on an Internet site maintained by or on behalf of WorkSafe. This must be done at the same time as the notice is published in the Gazette, or as soon as practicable after that. The regulation also explains that the Internet site must include a statement that clearly identifies where a copy of the notice can be found. Reg 111 A consolidation of certificates. This regulation explains that certain certificates relating to an installation may be combined into one document. It explains that certificates of compliance, including any related records of inspection, for prescribed electrical work done on all or part of an installation may be consolidated into a single document. It also explains that electrical safety certificates for the whole installation, or for any part of the installation, may also be included in that same document. The regulation then explains that when certificates are consolidated, any information that is the same for each certificate does not need to be repeated in the combined document. It also explains that the authentication mark only needs to be included once on, or in, the consolidated document. Reg 111b Authentication Mark. This regulation explains the requirements for the authentication mark used on electrical certificates. It explains that the authentication mark required for certificates of compliance, records of inspection, and electrical safety certificates must be included in, or on, the certificate. The regulation then explains that the authentication mark must be in the form shown in Schedule 7. It also explains that the mark must be of a suitable size and placed so that it is easy to see on the front of the certificate, or near the top of the certificate. Reg 111 C Offences relating to application of authentication mark. This regulation explains when the use of an authentication mark becomes an offence. It explains that a person commits an offence and may be convicted and given a Level 2 penalty if they include an authentication mark, in the form shown in Schedule 7, in or on a document where that document is not, but could reasonably be mistaken for, a certificate of compliance or an electrical safety certificate. It also explains that an offence is committed if the authentication mark is included in or on a document that is, or could reasonably be mistaken for, advertising material. Reg 112 Details that must be provided in reports of accidents. This regulation explains what information must be included when an accident is reported to WorkSafe. It explains that a person who is required to notify WorkSafe of an accident must provide a full written report. That report must include the name and contact details of the person giving the notice, including phone numbers and an email address where possible. It must also include the place, date, and time of the accident, along with a full description of what happened. The regulation explains that the report must describe any injuries, damage, or losses that resulted from the accident. Where known, it must include the names and contact details of any witnesses, investigators at the scene, or other people who may have useful information. It must also include any possible causes of the accident, if these are known. It further explains that if resuscitation was applied, the report must include details of the method used, how long it was applied, why it was stopped, and the name of the person who applied it. The report must also include details of any equipment involved, including the type of equipment, whether it operated correctly, and, if it did not, the reasons why. The condition and age of any associated equipment must also be included. Where known, the report must also include the name, age, sex, occupation, and residential address of the victim. The regulation then explains that an accident may first be notified to WorkSafe by phone, fax, email, or other electronic means, but that the full written report must be sent to WorkSafe within 2 weeks after that initial notification. The regulation finishes by explaining that the full written report may be sent to WorkSafe by post, fax, email, or any other electronic means. That brings us to the end of this audiobook on the Electricity Safety Regulations 2010. In this audiobook, we have covered key parts including Part 3 on systems of supply, Part 5 on the safety of installations, Part 6 on the safety of fittings and appliances, Part 8 on working practices, and Part 9 on accidents and reporting. Together, these parts set out the core responsibilities for people who design, install, maintain, test, inspect, supply, or work on electrical installations and equipment in New Zealand. They explain how electricity must be supplied safely, how installations, fittings, and appliances must be managed, how work must be carried out safely, and what must be done when things go wrong. This content is also directly relevant for the Electrical Workers Registration Board Regulation exam and is intended to support exam preparation by helping you understand how the regulations apply in real work situations. Remember, this audiobook is a learning guide only. The official electricity safety regulations are the legal source and must always be referred to when carrying out prescribed electrical work or sitting the EWRB regulation exam. Thanks for listening and stay safe around electricity.